The footman did not meet her eyes. That was the thing Eleanor noticed first. Standing at the back of Ashcroft Hall on a Tuesday morning in October, her gloved hand raised to knock at the servants' entrance of the house she had managed for 8 years. The footman, a young man named Perkins whom she had engaged herself at a hiring fair in Whitbury 3 winters past, kept his gaze fixed at some middle distance above her left shoulder. His livery was new. Crispin had changed the household colors from burgundy to gray almost before the period of mourning had ended, and the gray did not suit Perkins. Eleanor had thought so at the time, and thought so now, and the specificity of that observation, the intimacy of it, the fact that she knew this young man's livery better than he knew it himself, pressed against the inside of her ribs like a bruise she had not yet had occasion to press. "Mr. Bassett will see you in the back sitting room," Perkins said. He did not say Miss Hartley as he once had before she married. He did not say Mrs. Bassett as he had been trained to do during her 8 years as his employer. He said you, without an address attached, the way one might speak to a tradesman whose name one did not know. Eleanor said, "Thank you, Perkins," and stepped across the threshold. It was the sound that struck her. She had used this entrance perhaps a dozen times. In 8 years, always to supervise the delivery of provisions, always moving with purpose and authority through the stone passage that led from the back of the house to the kitchen corridor. Now the passage smelled of tallow and soap just as it always had. The copper pots in the kitchen doorway caught the same thin October light that had always found them there. A black cat she did not recognize sat on the window ledge and blinked at her once, then looked away as though even animals had been informed of the change in the social order. She had come for the miniature. There was no other reason she would have come to the back entrance of the house that had been hers. Not the jointure which her solicitor was managing through letters with Crispin's people, and not the question of the winter stores she had laid in before Alistair died, which Crispin had simply absorbed into the running of the estate without acknowledgement. She had come for a small oval locket, 1.5 inches across, painted on ivory in the year of her mother's marriage, set in a gold frame with a border of seed pearls that Alistair had commissioned as a wedding present, because he had known, without being told, that it was the only thing from her prior life she truly wished to keep. The locket had been left on the dressing table in the upstairs sitting room the morning the fever took him, when the household had descended into the particular chaos of crisis, and Eleanor had not thought to collect it before Crispin's solicitor arrived within the fortnight with the documents that transferred the house. She was thinking about the seed pearl border, and the exact quality of her mother's painted expression, when she heard hoofbeats on the front gravel. She did not stop, but she heard them, and through the narrow mullioned window at the end of the passage she saw, for just a moment, a man on a dark horse draw up before the house and pause. He sat very still in the saddle. He was looking at the servants' entrance. He was looking, she understood a half-second later, at her. She walked on. The horse and its rider did not follow her inside. But the memory of that pause, that stillness, the quality of attention from a man she did not yet have a name for, followed her through the gray-liveried passage and into the back sitting room where Crispin Bassett was waiting. If you have ever watched a house absorb a woman's 8 years and then return her none of it, you will understand something of what Eleanor Hartley had become by the time she arrived at the servants' entrance on that Tuesday morning. She had come to Ashcroft Hall as a bride of 19, the daughter of a country clergyman who had died, leaving 3 girls and a modest income that declined a little each year. Sir Alistair Bassett was 20 years her senior, gentle-natured, not unhandsome, genuinely kind in the particular way of men who have had kindness modeled for them by a good mother and have never had occasion to override it. Their marriage was not a passion. It was something quieter, and Eleanor had always believed more durable. A mutual respect, a shared management of a house and land that neither had been born to manage alone, a genuine friendship that had deepened slowly into the kind of warmth that does not announce itself. She had managed Ashcroft with real ability. The household accounts were hers. The kitchen garden, the linen, the annual letting of the lower fields, the negotiations with the coal merchant in Whitbury, the question of the roof over the east wing and the drains along the lower path, the engagement and dismissal of servants. The Christmas boxes and the harvest supper, and the careful calibration of every social obligation that attached to an estate of Ashcroft's standing. All of this had been hers for 8 years, and she had discharged it with the methodical competence of a woman who had been educated above her station and had found, to her great relief, a station that required precisely that education. Alistair had been grateful. In the particular way of men who understand what they are receiving and cannot quite articulate it, Eleanor had been content in the particular way of women who know their own competence and have found a place for it. Then the fever came, in February. It lasted 11 days. On the 12th day, Alistair was gone, and by the end of the fortnight, Mr. Second. Crispin Bassett, a cousin Eleanor, had met at exactly 4 dinner parties over the course of 8 years, arrived with a solicitor and a document confirming what the entail had always guaranteed. In the absence of a male heir, Ashcroft Hall passed to the nearest male of the Bassett line. Eleanor had known this was coming. She had known it in the abstract for the entirety of her marriage. Knowing a thing in the abstract and knowing it in the specific are different forms of knowledge. And the specific arrived with Crispin's carriage crunching over the front gravel, while Alistair had not yet been in the ground 6 weeks. Her jointure, provided for in the marriage settlement, was to be £300 per annum, drawn from the estate's rental income. This was not magnificent. It was survivable. Crispin's solicitor had written within the month to suggest that the settlement document was ambiguous on a particular point of timing, and that while the matter was being reviewed, the quarterly payment would be withheld. Eleanor's solicitor, a careful man named Mr. Fenn, had written back with measured force. The correspondence continued. The quarter went unpaid. The winter was coming. She had taken a set of lodgings in the village of Whitbury, 1.5 miles from Ashcroft's gates. She had one maid, a young woman from the village named Meg, who stayed out of loyalty rather than sense. She had the careful economies of a woman who has managed a large household and knows precisely how far a small income may be stretched if one is neither proud nor wasteful. What she did not have was the locket. She had written to Crispin asking for it. He had replied through his solicitor that all personal effects within Ashcroft Hall were currently being inventoried and could not be removed until the inventory was complete. When she had applied to the house directly, the housekeeper, Mrs. Greer, a woman Eleanor had employed and paid for 6 years, had informed her at the front door that Mr. Bassett was not at home to visitors. On the second occasion, Greer had said with visible discomfort that she had been instructed to receive any future correspondence from Mrs. Bassett at the servants' entrance. Eleanor had stood at the front door and looked at Mrs. Greer for a long moment. Then she had said thank you and walked back to the village. It was 2 miles in October, rain, and her shoes were thin, and she walked the whole distance without once looking back at the gates of Ashcroft Hall. The man on the dark horse had a name, and she learned it in the back sitting room. He had come to see Crispin about the drainage easement along the lower path, which crossed a strip of land belonging to the adjacent estate at Wentmore, and Crispin had been gratified enough by the call to keep him in conversation for the better part of 20 minutes in the front hall before directing him to the morning room. This meant that when Eleanor was shown out of the back sitting room by Perkins and directed along the corridor toward the kitchen exit, she turned a corner and found herself standing 6 feet from a man she had seen through a window, a man who had sat very still on the dark horse, and watched her cross a threshold she should not have had to use. He was tall in the way of men whose height is a given rather than a statement, spare in build, dark-haired, with a face whose natural set was not precisely cold but had clearly settled over time into something close to it. He was perhaps 35. He wore a navy coat and carried his hat at his side, and he turned at the sound of her footstep and looked at her with the particular quality of attention she had noticed from the window. Complete and unhurried, and just long enough to be something other than polite. Crispin appeared behind him. "Ah," Crispin said, "Lord Wentmore. May I present Mrs. Bassett, my cousin's widow, not Eleanor. Not Miss Hardley, which she had been before, nor Mrs. Bassett, which she had been during my cousin's widow." The possessive was pointed, and the noun was a category rather than a name, Lord Wentmore inclined his head. "Mrs. Bassett," he said, his voice level. "My lord," she said. There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds. Lord Wentmore's gaze moved once, from her face to Crispin's, and then back. He said nothing further. Eleanor excused herself with correct composure, and Perkins escorted her to the kitchen door, and she went out into the October morning and walked the 1.5 miles home. She did not allow herself to think about his face until she was safely inside with the door shut. Ashcroft Hall employed 14 servants, and of the 14, 3 had been there when Eleanor arrived as a bride. Mrs. Tate, the cook, was one of them. She was 61 years old, broad in the shoulder, imperturbable in the way of women who have made soups and cakes in the same kitchen for 30 years and have seen everything the house has seen. She had been fond of Sir Alister, in the uncomplicated way of a good servant who is well treated. She was fond of Eleanor in a way that was harder to name, which is to say, she was the kind of woman who demonstrates affection by noting, from across a room, that you have not eaten enough at a meal, and then quietly ensuring that the next meal is slightly better than strictly necessary. Eleanor returned to Ashcroft Hall a week later, on a Wednesday, not to see Crispin, but to sit for a quarter hour in the kitchen passage, while Mrs. Crispin Tate gave her tea she had not asked for, and information she was careful not to ask for. Directly, the kitchen was warm. The smell of it was the same as it had always been. Bread and wood smoke and the particular sweetness of the apple stores. That Mrs. Mitte. What then? Tate kept in the larder through the winter, and Eleanor sat with her hands wrapped around a cup that was too full and let herself be warm for a moment in a house that was no longer hers. It was during this visit, while she was sitting at the end of the long pine table, and Mrs. Tate was making remarks about the quality of the new coal delivery, as though it were the most pressing matter in the county, that Eleanor heard the under-housemaid weeping in the scullery. The girl's name was Susanna. She was 17, had come to Ashcroft from a village near Shrewsbury the previous spring, and had learned 3 weeks ago that her mother had died of the same fever that had taken Sir Alister, delayed by distance and poor postal connection, so that Susanna had been unable to reach home before the end. Eleanor knew this because she knew almost everything about her former servants. Not as intelligence, but as the ordinary knowledge of a woman who had managed their welfare for 8 years. She set down her tea. She crossed the kitchen passage, pushed open the scullery door, and sat down on the low stool beside Susanna, without any announcement of her presence. The scullery was cold, the fire in the kitchen reaching only so far, and Susanna had drawn her apron up over her hands in the way of a girl who has been cold and crying long enough to stop noticing either. Eleanor did not say anything for a moment. She simply sat. The sound of Susanna's weeping was the particular sound of grief that has been held in check all day and has finally found a private corner. And Eleanor recognized it completely. "Then," she said quietly, "that grief that arrives after the fact is the hardest kind because it has no ceremony to hold it in shape." She said that the absence of a ceremony does not mean the loss is smaller. It means only that the loss must be carried differently, without the formal structure that usually tells a person where to put their hands and what to do with their face. She said that the carrying does get easier, not because the loss diminishes, but because the person carrying it grows, very gradually stronger, in the particular places where the weight presses. Susanna wept harder for a moment, and then very gradually, less hard, and then she looked up and saw who was sitting beside her, and her expression shifted into something bewildered. Eleanor handed her a folded handkerchief, one of her own, pressed and clean. "Keep it," she said, and stood and returned to her tea. She did not know that the Earl of Wentmore had come back to Ashcroft Hall that same Wednesday, on the matter of a further point about the drainage documents, and had been admitted to a rear corridor while Crispin was located, and that from that rear corridor there was a clear line of sight through the open scullery door. She did not know he had seen any of it. She did not know that he stood in the rear corridor for longer than the matter of the drainage documents strictly required, his hat still in his hand, watching a woman he had met once cross a cold stone floor, and sit down beside a weeping girl with the unhesitating ease of someone who has never needed an invitation to do what is simply right. She was not thinking about him at all when she walked home that afternoon. She was thinking about the locket, and about Mrs. Tate, who had pressed her hand at the kitchen door and said nothing, and about the particular quality of Susanna's bewilderment at being helped by a woman who no longer had any authority to help her. If she had paused at the gate, she might have noticed a dark horse at the edge of the lane, its rider motionless in the afternoon light, watching her go. She did not pause. The dinner at the Phelps establishment, held 3 weeks into November, was not the first time Eleanor had heard Crispin's aunt reduce her to a category. She had heard it once before, in the early weeks. Through a half-open drawing-room door, Mrs. Phelps's voice had carried clearly above the sound of china, saying to some visitor Eleanor could not see, "Of course, one must be kind, but the late Sir Alistair's widow has no claim on the household beyond what the law provides, and the law, I am afraid, is not sentimental." There had been a murmur of agreement. Eleanor had stood in the corridor for exactly the time it took to register what she had heard, and then she had walked on, because there was nothing to be done, and because she had long since learned that dignity is not a feeling, but a practice. The dinner was a different occasion. Crispin had chosen to invite a company of 12 to Ashcroft Hall, including, to Eleanor's genuine surprise, Eleanor herself. The invitation had come through Perkins, hand-delivered, written in the new Bassett stationery with the gray border. She had accepted because refusing would have been misconstrued, and because she had not yet been inside the main rooms of Ashcroft Hall since the change, and because she admitted to herself alone, curious in the way of a woman who knows she should not be. Lord Wentmore was also present. She registered this in the moment she entered the drawing-room, and he was the first person who looked up. He did not look away immediately. She found she was careful not to look at him too long. The drawing-room had been redecorated in some small ways since Eleanor's time, the curtains exchanged for a heavier damask, in a dark gold that was not unpleasant, but was not the room she had known, and the arrangement of the furniture had shifted so that the settee she had always placed facing the fire now faced the window instead. It was not a bad room. It was simply not her room. Eleanor stood in it, with the composed expression of a woman who has learned to visit places that used to be hers. Miss Crowe was there, at Mrs. Phelps's side, in ice-blue silk. She was very handsome. In the cold, particular way of women who have never had to try to belong anywhere, she looked at Eleanor once with the measured assessment of a woman calculating a possible threat, and then, having completed the calculation and evidently found the figure negligible, looked away. Eleanor had seen that look before, on other women's faces in other rooms, and she knew what it meant. It meant that she had been categorized and set aside. The dinner itself proceeded correctly through its courses. Eleanor sat at the far end of the table from Crispin, beside a local vicar whose wife had long been a friend of hers, and she ate and spoke and laughed when the occasion required it, and was, she believed, entirely unremarkable. She was watching the room from behind her composure, as she had always done, noting who spoke too much and who watched too carefully. And in this way she had been monitoring the conversation when Crispin, in the easy way of a man who has forgotten that there are people present who might correct him, made a remark about the inventory. He said the estate's personal effects had been catalogued at last, and it was a considerable collection, and that he was inclined to hold an auction of certain duplicate pieces. He named several items. Among them, parenthetically offered to the table as though its significance were negligible, he mentioned a small gold locket with a pearl border. He did not say it was Eleanor's. He did not say that her name was on it, that her mother's face was inside it, that it had been given to Eleanor by a man who had understood without instruction what it meant to her. He said it as though it were one item among others. Eleanor set down her spoon. She said, "The locket is not a Bassett piece, Mr. Bassett. It belonged to my mother before her marriage to my father, and was given to me as a wedding present from my late husband. I believe Mr. Dedding. Fenn has the relevant documentation." Crispin looked at her, the way men look at women who have said something technically correct, at the wrong moment, "My dear Mrs. Guy." "Bassett," he said, and his voice held the warmth of a man confident. "He is winning. These are matters for the solicitors. No need to trouble the company. I mention it only so that the company is not troubled by an auction of my property," Eleanor said. There was a silence. Mrs. Phelps at Crispin's right raised her fan a half-inch and said in the patient tone of a woman managing a difficult situation, "The late Sir Alistair's widow has had a considerable shock. We must all be patient." The dismissal was perfectly executed. It addressed Eleanor without addressing her argument. It acknowledged her grief and used it to set aside her claim. Several guests looked at their plates. Lord Wentmore at the middle of the table did not. He was looking at Crispin with an expression Eleanor could not read from where she sat, and he did not look away until the topic shifted. Eleanor finished her meal. She did not permit herself to shake. She permitted herself to shake slightly. Later in the cold of the carriage, once she was alone and moving away from the gates of Ashcroft, and she sat very still inside the shaking, and let it run through her and waited for it to stop, which it did, eventually, by the time the lanterns of Whitbury came into view. She had not wept since the night Alistair died. She did not weep now. She had been told she was not grieving correctly, that her composure was pride, that her management of the practical matters of her situation was heartlessness. She had let people say these things. None of them had been inside her body, in the 11 days of the fever, sitting beside a man who was not precisely her great love, but was genuinely her friend. Watching him diminish by increments so specific, she could have measured them by the hour. She had loved Alistair. In the quiet, practical, earned way. She was allowed to mourn him in the same register. The third occasion arrived, not at a dinner table but in a cold passage in the village of Whitbury, relayed not by Crispin himself, but by a tradesman's wife, who repeated it without intending any cruelty, having overheard it from a maid who had overheard it from another. Miss Crowe, Crispin's intended, had remarked at a private gathering that the late Sir Alistair's widow was making rather a scene over a trinket that had, by all accounts, never been hers to begin with. Eleanor heard this in the passage outside the Drapers, in the grey cold of a November afternoon, and she stood for a moment in the particular stillness of a person who has received one blow too many to react to the most recent one immediately. Then she thanked the tradesman's wife, who was looking worried, and said she was quite well, and walked home. That evening she sat alone at the small writing table in her lodgings in Whitbury, and looked at the blank letter paper for some time before she wrote to Mr. Fenn. She told him the quarterly payment was still outstanding, and that she wrote carefully, in some difficulty, as regarded the winter. She told him she believed the inventory was nearly complete, and that the locket was her property, documented, and she required it returned. She told him she was well and managing. She told him this because it was mostly true, and because it was the thing she said to everyone, and because it was the thing she would continue to say until it became more fully true, as things do. In time, if you continue to act as though they are. Mr. Fenn wrote back within 4 days to say he had been in contact with a Lord Wentmore, who had taken some interest in the matter of the settlement, and that he would be attending a gathering at Wentmore in a fortnight's time if Mrs. Trex. Bassett cared to attend. She read the letter twice. She sat with it for a long time. She went. The gathering at Wentmore was a small one. 10 people in the informal drawing room of a house that was large, but not trying to seem so, its furniture comfortable and its fires well stoked against the late November cold. Eleanor arrived with the vicar's wife, her friend, because she did not arrive anywhere alone now, if it could be arranged. She was composed. She was wearing her second-best gown, which was green and becoming, and she had done her hair with Meg's help, and she was not afraid. Or if she was, it was a form of fear that she had long since learned to carry like a coat, worn rather than displayed. The house at Wentmore had been built a generation before Ashcroft, and had the settled quality of a place that has been lived in continuously rather than managed. The books in the library were red books, their spines cracked. The carpets in the hall were good, but showed the particular wear of years of feet rather than the pristine preservation of rooms kept for show. There was a portrait at the end of the hall, a woman in a white gown with dark hair and a composed expression. And Eleanor understood without being told that this was the late Lady Wentmore, and she did not look at it long. Lord Wentmore received his guests with the formal courtesy of a man who was an excellent host, because the alternative is letting people do whatever they like in his drawing room, which he would find considerably worse. He did not speak to Eleanor privately in the first hour. He spoke to the vicar and to Crispin about the drainage easement, and to Mrs. Phelps about her sister's health, with the patient attention of a man who is managing several things at once and showing none of them. Eleanor watched him without meaning to, and caught herself, and looked elsewhere, and then looked back, which told her something she was not entirely ready to know. Crispin arrived 20 minutes after Eleanor did, with Mrs. Phelps and Miss Crow and a solicitor. She did not recognize, he had not expected Eleanor. She could see that in the brief recalibration of his expression when he entered the room, and found her standing beside the fireplace with a cup of tea and the composed expression of a woman who has been in harder rooms than this one. Mr. Fenn arrived at 4:30. He carried a leather satchel. He shook hands with Lord Wentmore, and then he shook hands with Eleanor, and he said, "The settlement is entirely clear, Mrs. Bassett. I have the original here. There is no ambiguity about the locket." Crispin began to say something. He had drawn himself up with the confidence of a man who has had several months of legal correspondence proceed in his favor, and has begun to mistake the slowness of the law for approval. He said that the matter was under review. He said that the inventory had only just been completed, and that any transfer of personal effects needed to be considered against the full estate picture. He said this with the authority of a man who has a solicitor at his elbow, and a house at his back, and a fiancée in ice blue silk watching from across the room. And for a moment the room contracted around those facts in the way that rooms do when a man with position speaks. Lord Wentmore turned from the window where he had been standing, crossed the room in 3 strides, and placed himself between Eleanor and Crispin, with the unhurried certainty of a man who has calculated the geometry of the situation and knows exactly where he belongs in it. He did not raise his voice. He did not posture. He stood in the room, as a fact, the way a man stands when he does not need to perform authority, because he simply has it, and he said in a voice that was level and entirely unhurried, "Miss Hartley was mistress of Ashcroft Hall. She still is." 9 words. He had used her maiden name, not as a correction of the widow's title, but as a restoration of her identity. The name that had been hers before the entail and Crispin's arrival had reduced her to a category. He said it with a specificity that was deliberate, and in the silence that followed, the room absorbed what it meant. It meant he knew who she was before she was a widow. It meant he had attended to her with enough care to know the name her own father had given her, and the name she had carried into a house that was supposed to be hers. It meant that the reduction to my cousin's widow, and the late Sir Alistair's widow, and the widow making rather a scene was, as far as he was concerned, completed and done. Mrs. Phelps's fan stilled. Miss Crow said nothing. Crispin's solicitor looked at his papers. Lord Wentmore held Crispin's gaze for exactly as long as required, which was not long, because the gaze was the kind that does not need to be held long to make its meaning understood. Then he looked at Eleanor and she looked back, and her hands were steady at her sides, and her breathing was steady, and she was looking at him with the expression of a woman who has been holding herself very carefully in shape for several months, and has, in this moment, been given something to hold herself against. "Mr. Vernon." Fenn opened his satchel and produced 3 documents, and laid them on the table beside the tea service, and the company spent the next quarter hour attending to the legal business of the jointure and the matter of the miniature with the concentrated quiet of people who have understood that something has shifted in the room and are not yet sure what it means. For them, the jointure was confirmed. The locket was confirmed as Eleanor's property, its provenance established in the original marriage settlement, which Mr. Fenn had obtained from the archive in London, and which was, as he had said, entirely clear. Crispin signed the necessary acknowledgment with the expression of a man completing an arithmetic problem that has come out in someone else's favor. Mrs. Stay. Phelps's expression was the particular composure of a woman who has been publicly wrong and has decided to survive it by ignoring that she was wrong, which is a kind of courage in its way, though not the kind Eleanor would have chosen. When the business was done, and the tea had been refreshed, and the company had settled again into the small conversations that reassert the fiction that nothing particular has occurred, Lord Wentmore came to stand beside Eleanor at the window. He said, "I am sorry you were made to come to that door." He meant the servants' entrance. He had not mentioned it before. She had not known until this moment that he had been carrying it. She looked at the darkening garden and the first stars beginning above the ridge, and the bare elm at the edge of the lawn that stood in the November dark with the particular patience of old trees. She said, "It is a very good house." "It was," he said. A pause. "It was managed well." She understood that he knew. She did not ask how. She thought of the scullery and the weeping housemaid, and the particular stillness of a man on a dark horse in a lane, watching without announcing himself, and she understood that Lord Wentmore had been paying attention to her for considerably longer than she had been paying attention to him. She said, "Your estate is a good house also." "It is very quiet," he said. He turned slightly toward her, and in the window she could see the faint reflection of his face, and behind it the room full of people and the fire and the lamps coming up against the evening. Then after a moment that was careful and deliberate, "I lost my wife 3 years ago. She was young. There was a child." He did not say more than that. He did not need to. The sentence had the specific weight of a sentence that has been waiting some time to be spoken, and it landed in the warmth of the room with the care of something fragile being set down on a table that one trusts to bear the weight. Eleanor said, "I am sorry. I have been," he said, "too careful since." Of everything he was quiet for a moment. Outside, the first snow of winter had begun to fall, very fine, catching the lamplight from the window. "I have found it is not an improvement." She looked at him then. He was looking at the snow, and the snow was catching in his dark hair, and she looked away before he could catch her looking, but not before she had registered completely the particular sensation of standing very close to a person whose presence in the room she has been aware of for months without having a name for the awareness. The party dispersed at 9. Eleanor rode back to Whitbury with the vicar's wife, who was warm and sensible and asked her nothing, for which Eleanor was grateful, because she had nothing to say, and was still in the process of understanding what had happened in the room at Wentmore. Mrs. Tate appeared at Eleanor's lodgings in Whitbury 3 days later, with a wrapped parcel and an expression that managed simultaneously to be guilty and pleased. The parcel contained the locket. Mrs. Tate had retrieved it from the inventory room where it had been placed. She said before the inventory was finalized, which meant technically that it had not yet been formally assigned to the estate. Eleanor received this legal reasoning with the solemnity it deserved. She held the locket in her palm. It was exactly as she remembered: the oval frame, the seed pearl border, the gold worm from Mrs. Metter. Tate's coat pocket where it had been kept for 3 days like a living thing requiring warmth. She opened it. Her mother looked out from the ivory as she had always looked, the expression not quite a smile but in the vicinity of one, patient and composed, the expression of a woman who has understood that things take time and has made a philosophical accommodation with time. "You did not have to do that," Eleanor said. "No," said Mrs. Tate. "But I have known you since you were 19 years old and walked into my kitchen not knowing where anything was, and asked me to show you which no one had ever thought to do before. And I have thought a great many things about this autumn that I shall not say to you directly, because you have had quite enough said to you directly." She stood up and buttoned her coat. "Herkins is very sorry, by the by." "Tell him I know, Eleanor," said Mrs. Tate left. Eleanor sat with the locket for a long time, turning it in her hands, feeling the weight of it, the specific warmth of the gold that had been worn against her skin for so many years that it seemed to carry the warmth still. Outside the window of the lodging rooms in Whitbury, the snow from the previous night had settled on the village rooftops in the thin, clean way of early winter, and the afternoon light was the particular silver light of a December day that is decided to be beautiful rather than cold. She thought about 8 years. She thought about what 8 years looks like from inside. The small accumulation of days, the household accounts and the harvest suppers and the coal negotiations and the kitchen garden in April. She thought about Alistair's gratitude, genuine and inarticulate. She thought about Susanna in the scullery and Mrs. Tate's pressed hand at the door, and the sound of a man's voice in a lit room saying 9 words she had not expected to be given. She thought about the portrait at the end of the hall at Wentmore, and the woman in the white gown, and what it might mean to live in a house where someone else's grief was also present, not as a shadow, but as a room one moves through on the way to other rooms. Lord Wentmore arrived the following afternoon, with a letter from Mr. Allery. Fenn confirming the first quarterly payment of the jointure had been released, and with a question that was not quite a question, delivered with the careful formality of a man who has spent 3 years mistaking control for penance and has recently begun, slowly, to reconsider. He said he had a house that was very quiet. He said he thought it was perhaps too quiet. He said he was aware this was not the conventional manner of addressing such a matter, and that he was not in general a man given to proceeding in unconventional ways, but that he had found in the last several months that the conventional approach was, occasionally, insufficient to the situation. He stood at the window of her small sitting room with his hat in both hands, and looked at her with the particular directness of a man who is saying exactly what he means, and is not accustomed to it, and is doing it anyway. He did not say he loved her. It was too early for that, and he was an honest man, and the word was one he had not used in 3 years. He said instead that he would very much like to know her better if she was willing to be known, and that he understood if the season had made her cautious, and that he would wait. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. She was thinking of the servants' door, and the footman who had not met her eyes, and of Crispin's dining table and the fan raised a half-inch, and of the snow falling against black glass, while a man told her quietly that he had been too careful since. She was thinking of all the things she had continued to do during this autumn, because they were the right things to do. The tea in the kitchen passage, the stool in the scullery, the letter to Fenn, the arrival at Wentmore with her chin up and her second-best gown and the composed face of a woman who has not yet stopped being herself, despite considerable effort from several directions. She thought of 9 words, level and unhurried in a room full of people. She said, "I think I should like that very much." He left with the formality appropriate to the conversation, and returned the following week, and the week after that, and they walked in the grounds of Wentmore in the early December cold, with a distance between them that was careful and correct, and growing, very slowly, less so. And Eleanor learned the house and the grounds and the way he moved in them with the methodical attention she had always brought to any place she was considering making her own. And he learned the cadence of her thought and the quality of her silence, and the particular precision of her when she disagreed with something, which was more often than he had expected, and which he found he liked considerably. The snow continued deepening over the village and the lane and the fields between Whitbury and Wentmore, and the miniature locket lay on Eleanor's dressing table each night with its gold frame catching the candlelight, her mother's face composed and serene inside it, patient as ever, waiting for the story to finish finding its shape. By Christmas, the fire at Wentmore burned very warm. By the new year, the house was not quiet at all. The locket rested at last against Eleanor's collarbone, worn in its proper place, and outside the long window, the snow went on falling over the English countryside with the steady, unhurried patience of everything that was always going to come out right. If you have stayed with Eleanor through this long autumn, leave a word in the quiet of what you are feeling. It is enough to have been here.